He left her broken, but years later, he saw his ex-wife as a strong military mom with triplets and collapsed in guilt. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. Today is Sunday, a sacred day of rest, reflection, and prayer. And before we begin, I want to ask something deeply important. Please say a prayer for every soldier, every brave soul fighting to protect their country. They stand in silence while we sleep in peace. May they be covered in grace, guided by light, and never forgotten in our hearts. Now, my sweet family, I need to speak from a place of love, but also truth. Many of you have started leaving the story halfway, and it hurts. These stories aren't just written, they're felt. They're given. Every second comes from my heart to yours. When you walk away early, it feels like you stopped listening to my soul. And yes, some have said James is boring. But let me ask you this, with love. Are you giving him the same patience you once gave me? He's carrying my voice while I'm unwell, doing his best to hold this family together. If he's not connecting, just tell me. I'll understand. But don't leave in silence. Don't leave in the middle, not today, not on a day of prayer and purpose. Stay. Let your heart be touched. You might not realize it, but I feel every absence. I notice every silence. And now I ask gently, when this story ends, please rate it out of 10 in the comments. Let me know if you're still here. Let me feel your love. I need it more than you know. And please, tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your country. Let's fill the comment section with family from all over the world. Let this video be more than just a story. Let it be a moment of unity. Let's begin. With all my love, always.
Some nights change everything, and you can feel it in your bones before the first word is spoken, before the first glance shatters your carefully constructed world into a million irreparable pieces. Mike Puranen had built his empire on certainty, predicting market trends, controlling outcomes, eliminating variables that might threaten his success. But standing in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton, surrounded by decorated officers and their families, he felt his carefully constructed world shifting beneath him. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, their light catching military insignia like scattered stars in a constellation he couldn't decipher. He shouldn't have come. His assistant had insisted the annual Military Heroes Charity Gala would be excellent for community relations. But Mike trusted his instincts about uncomfortable situations. Tonight, that instinct screamed danger. Perhaps it was how conversations quieted when he approached, or how the genuine camaraderie between military families highlighted his own carefully cultivated isolation. The tech industry had made Mike wealthy beyond imagination, but it had also made him soft. These people around him, officers who'd served in combat zones, spouses who'd managed deployments and relocations, children who'd grown up understanding sacrifice, they possessed a kind of strength he'd never developed. Their bonds were forged in shared hardship, while his relationships were built on mutual benefit and expired the moment they became inconvenient. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, "please welcome this year's recipient of the Outstanding Service Award, Captain Jessica Gomez." The name hit Mike like a physical blow. Jessica. His chest tightened as a figure in midnight blue dress uniform approached the podium with fluid grace. 8 years collapsed into a heartbeat as he recognized the woman he'd once promised to love forever, the 20-year-old girl he'd abandoned when responsibility became inconvenient, and his secretary's youth seemed more appealing than his pregnant wife's morning sickness. But this wasn't the tearful girl who'd begged him to stay. This woman commanded attention without demanding it, moved with confidence born from testing herself against adversity and emerging victorious. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, revealing the strong jawline he remembered, but everything else had transformed. Where once there had been softness, now there was steel. Where dependence once lived, absolute self-possession reigned. Captain Jessica Gomez began to speak, her voice carrying easily through the ballroom with clear authority. "When I first put on this uniform 8 years ago," she began, "I was a young single mother looking for a way to serve something greater than my own broken dreams. I never imagined that service would teach me the most important lesson of my life, that strength isn't about what you can endure alone, but about what you can build when you refuse to let circumstances define your destiny." Mike's hands gripped his champagne glass until it threatened to shatter. The irony cut deep. He had been one of those circumstances she'd refused to let define her. But as she continued speaking about resilience and military families supporting each other through hardships, his attention was drawn to the front row where 3 children sat with rapt attention. The boy, perhaps 8 years old, sat with perfect posture, his green eyes, Mike's eyes, fixed on Jessica with obvious adoration. Beside him, a girl with curly hair tucked a strand behind her ear, in a gesture so familiar it stopped Mike's breath. His mother had done that exact movement, as had his sister, as had he himself when nervous. The third child, another girl, smaller and more animated, bounced slightly in her seat with excitement, her features a perfect blend of his angular cheekbones and Jessica's warm smile. The realization hit him with meteor force. These weren't random children. These were his children. The triplets Jessica had been carrying when he walked out, when he'd said those words that would haunt him forever. "I'm not ready for kids, Jess. I never will be." "Emma, Lucas, Sophie," he whispered their names into the champagne-scented air, somehow knowing them with absolute certainty. They were 8 years old now, the exact age they should be. They had his eyes, his bone structure, his grandmother's stubborn chin. They were his children, and they were looking at Jessica with pure love and pride he'd never inspired in anyone. The weight of 8 years crashed down on him simultaneously. 8 years of missed bedtime stories, scraped knees he hadn't kissed, first words he'd never heard, Christmas mornings that had happened without him. 8 years of a father's love that had gone to another man because Mike had been too immature, too selfish, too terrified of responsibility to claim it. As Jessica concluded to thunderous applause, Mike watched the children leap to their feet, clapping with uninhibited joy. But it was the man who moved to stand beside them that delivered the final blow. Tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a major's uniform, he gathered the children close with easy familiarity. The little girl, Sophie, climbed onto his shoulders while the other 2 pressed against his sides. When Jessica stepped down from the podium, she moved directly to this family unit with natural magnetism. Mike watched, transfixed, as Jessica kissed the man's cheek and ruffled Lucas's hair, as Emma showed her a drawing, as Sophie whispered something that made her laugh. They were a family, complete, happy, functioning without any awareness that the man who should have been the father stood watching from across the room like a ghost. "Beautiful family, aren't they?" Mike startled at the voice beside him. An elderly woman with kind eyes smiled warmly. "Captain Gomez and Major Brewer are base royalty," she continued. "Those children are devoted to their father. David's been raising them since they were babies, stepped up when their birth father abandoned them. Real hero, that man. They're getting married next month. The whole base is invited." Mike excused himself and found the bar, ordering whiskey to stop the spinning sensation threatening to bring him to his knees. Jessica hadn't just survived his abandonment, she'd transformed it into triumph. She'd taken the pregnancy he'd rejected and built a military career around protecting families. She'd found a man who clearly worshipped her and loved his children as his own. When he turned back toward the crowd, Jessica was accepting congratulations, while David corralled the children. Mike watched David lift Sophie higher and listen intently to something Lucas was explaining with animated gestures. Emma stood close to Jessica's side, touching her mother's arm with unconscious need for connection that spoke of absolute security. Jessica's eyes swept the crowd during a lull in conversation, and for one heart-stopping moment, her gaze met his across the ballroom. Mike expected shock, recognition, perhaps anger. Instead, Jessica's expression remained perfectly composed, almost serene. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to acknowledge recognition, long enough to show she felt no need to hide or flee, long enough to demonstrate that his presence was simply irrelevant to her happiness. Then she turned back to her family, and Mike understood with crystalline clarity that he wasn't part of this equation anymore. He wasn't the villain of Jessica's story or the lost love she mourned. He was simply nothing. A chapter she'd closed so completely that seeing him again was like encountering a stranger who happened to share some distant history. As the evening wound down, Mike watched his children laugh and play while their parents packed programs and collected flowers. When David lifted Lucas onto his shoulders and took Emma's hand while Jessica carried sleepy Sophie, they moved as a unit born of years of practice, years of love, years of choosing each other every single day. Mike Purinin had come to the gala expecting boredom. Instead, he'd discovered that some mistakes don't just change your future. They create futures for other people to live while you stand watching from the outside, finally understanding what you'd thrown away and who had been wise enough to treasure it instead. Chapter 2. The Path of Strength. They say curiosity killed the cat, but they never mention that ignorance can murder a man's soul, slowly, methodically, one revealed truth at a time. Mike Puranin hadn't slept in 3 days. The sleepless nights following the gala had been filled with frantic internet searches, private investigator consultations, and the kind of desperate digging that comes when a man realizes he's been living in a fantasy while real life happened without him. What he'd discovered in those 72 hours of obsessive research had dismantled every assumption he'd made about Jessica's life after their divorce. The private investigator's report lay spread across his mahogany desk like evidence in a trial where he served as both defendant and jury. Birth certificates, military service records, academic transcripts, medical records he had no right to access, but money could apparently buy. Each document told a story of extraordinary resilience that made his own accomplishments feel hollow by comparison. There were photos, too, hundreds of them, chronicling a life he'd never imagined. Jessica in her first military uniform, looking impossibly young but determined. The triplets at various stages of childhood, always clean and well-dressed despite their mother's obvious financial struggles. Family portraits from base events where Jessica gradually transformed from overwhelmed single mother to confident leader, while 3 small faces grew more secure and radiant with each passing year. Jessica Maria Gomez, she'd kept her maiden name after the divorce, had given birth to triplets on March 15th, 8 months after he'd walked out with 2 suitcases and a declaration that he needed to find himself. The babies arrived at St. Mary's Hospital at 2:47 a.m., 3:15 a.m., and 3:33 a.m. respectively. Emma Rose, Lucas Michael, and Sophie Grace. She'd given his son his middle name. He stared at that detail until his eyes burned. Even in her moment of ultimate abandonment, even while delivering 3 babies whose father had explicitly rejected them, Jessica had chosen to honor him. The generosity of that gesture, viewed through 8 years of hindsight, felt like a knife twisting in his chest. The investigator's notes painted a picture of early motherhood that shattered every comfortable assumption Mike had made about her post-divorce life. She hadn't returned to her parents, as he'd imagined. Her father died 2 years before their divorce, and her mother remarried a man who made clear that Jessica and her mistakes weren't welcome. Instead, she moved in with great-aunt Rosa, a 70-year-old widow who lived in a two-bedroom apartment above her small restaurant 30 miles from the city. Photos in the file showed a life Mike never imagined. Jessica at 19, visibly pregnant, working tables at Rosa's cafe with a forced smile. At 20, dark circles under her eyes, carrying 3 infant car seats while Rosa held the door open. At 21, in civilian clothes, standing outside a National Guard recruitment office with triplets in a stroller. Her expression determined in a way that spoke of last resorts and limited options. She joined the National Guard initially, the investigator had explained during their meeting. Part-time commitment that allowed her to stay home with the babies most of the week. Basic training was the hardest part. She had to leave the kids with Rosa for 8 weeks. Neighbors said Rosa cried every night, worried about managing 3 toddlers at her age, but she never complained. Said Jessica was the daughter she'd never had. The investigator had included a poignant detail that stayed with Mike. During those 8 weeks of basic training, Jessica had written letters to each baby every single night, even though they couldn't read. Rosa had saved them all, creating scrapbooks for each child that chronicled their mother's love and sacrifice during those crucial early months. She joined the National Guard initially, the investigator had explained. Part-time commitment that allowed her to stay home with the babies most of the week. Basic training was the hardest part. She had to leave the kids with Rosa for 8 weeks. Mike had asked about financial support, about whether Jessica had ever tried to contact him. The answer had been a definitive no. Jessica had applied for assistance, worked double shifts at Rosa's restaurant, sold her wedding ring for $200 to buy school supplies when the triplets started preschool. But she had never, not once, attempted to find Mike for support. The National Guard had changed everything. The military records showed a young woman who'd approached service with systematic determination. She'd scored in the 98th percentile on entrance exams, completed her specialty training in communications while taking online college courses during evenings when the children slept. Stellar recruit, the investigator had noted. Perfect attendance, rapid advancement, commendations for leadership. Her officers called her exceptional dedication. Jessica had earned her bachelor's degree in social work through online courses and evening classes, maintaining a 3.9 GPA while raising triplets and fulfilling guard obligations. She'd written her senior thesis on support systems for military families during deployment, a topic she'd later dedicate her career to addressing. The transition from National Guard to active duty came when the triplets were 4. By then, Jessica had established herself as invaluable, someone who could be counted on for both operational excellence and supporting fellow service members' families. That's where David Brewer entered the story. Major David Brewer, 32, widowed father of 1 daughter, specialist in logistics and family support programs. His wife had died in childbirth 4 years earlier, leaving him to raise their daughter, Sarah, alone. The investigator had uncovered how David and Jessica met at the base child care center during an emergency when both were struggling to balance unexpected duty extensions with parental responsibilities. Sarah Brewer had been 9, the triplets 4, and both parents frantically trying to arrange overnight care. They ended up sharing babysitting duties, the investigator reported. Started as practical necessity, became friendship, evolved into something deeper over 2 years. Colleagues describe it as the most natural progression they'd ever seen. Mike studied photos of David with an emotion he couldn't name. The man was undeniably handsome in a solid, dependable way that spoke of integrity rather than flash. But more than that, every photograph showed him interacting with the triplets with genuine engagement. David teaching Lucas to throw a baseball, David braiding Emma's hair for a school play, David carrying Sophie on his shoulders at a base picnic, while Jessica walked beside them, relaxed in a way Mike had never seen during their marriage. When the triplets were 6, David filed for adoption. Legal requirements were clear. Both biological parents had to either consent or be deemed to have abandoned their parental rights. Jessica's attorney made extensive efforts to locate Mike. Certified letters sent to his last known address, forwarded to his business. Public notices published in newspapers across 3 counties. A private investigator hired to track down current contact information. Mike's business attorney received the notices and attempted to reach him, but Mike was in Europe expanding operations, and his staff handled only urgent business matters. Apparently, legal termination of his parental rights didn't qualify as urgent. After 6 months of documented attempts, the court declared Mike's parental rights terminated due to abandonment, clearing the way for David's adoption. The judge's notes were matter of fact. Biological father has shown no interest in or support for these children for 6 years. Adoption is clearly in the children's best interest. Mike had been in Barcelona closing a $50 million deal on the day his parental rights were legally severed. He'd celebrated with champagne and a stranger whose name he couldn't remember, while 3,000 miles away, his children officially became someone else's family. The most recent documents showed the life Jessica had built through sheer determination. Her promotion to captain came with assignment to family readiness programs at Fort Braxton. Her performance evaluations read like testimonials to professional excellence, but her personal commendations revealed the woman she'd become. She'd been recognized for establishing support programs for single military parents. She'd received awards for her work with military spouses, pursuing higher education. She'd been featured in Military Family magazine for her innovative approaches to maintaining family connections during deployment. The final document was a wedding announcement from the base newsletter, dated for next month. The photo showed Jessica and David surrounded by the triplets, all of them laughing. Jessica wore a simple sundress and radiant smile, David's arm around her waist while the children clustered close. The caption read, "Captain Jessica Gomez and Major David Brewer announced their upcoming marriage. The couple met 5 years ago and have been partners in both military service and family life." Mike closed the file and stared out his office window, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd lost through his own choices. Jessica hadn't just moved on, she'd built something beautiful from the wreckage he'd left behind. She'd transformed his abandonment into strength, his rejection into resilience, his absence into an opportunity for someone worthy to step into the space he'd vacated. Mike Purinen had spent 8 years building a tech empire worth hundreds of millions. But Jessica had spent those same 8 years building something far more valuable, a family, a career, and a life that proved sometimes the most profound victory is simply refusing to let someone else's limitations define your possibilities. Chapter 3. The Family That Chose Each Other. Love, Mike discovered, wasn't something you deserved or inherited. It was something you earned through 10,000 small moments of showing up when showing up was hard. The Spring Valley Elementary School talent show was held in a gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and childhood dreams, where mismatched folding chairs had been arranged before a makeshift stage decorated with construction paper stars. Mike sat in the very back row, partially hidden behind a father with broad shoulders, feeling like an intruder at a celebration that had nothing to do with him. He'd driven here on impulse after seeing the school newsletter announcement in his private investigator's weekly update, telling himself he just wanted to see the children perform, to understand who they'd become. Nothing prepared him for the gut punch of watching his son take the stage. The gymnasium buzzed with the energy of proud families, cameras ready, grandparents adjusting their seats for better views. Mike noticed how many people greeted the Brewer family warmly as they found their seats. Teachers stopping to chat with Jessica about school fundraisers, other parents asking David about soccer practice schedules, children waving excitedly at the triplets and Sarah. They were clearly beloved members of this community, people whose presence enriched the lives of everyone around them. Lucas Michael, his middle name a ghost of connection Mike didn't deserve, approached the microphone with quiet confidence that spoke of a child who'd never doubted his worth. At 8 years old, he possessed an unusual combination of thoughtfulness and natural charisma that drew the audience's attention before he'd spoken a single word. He wore a simple button-down shirt and pressed khakis, his dark hair combed neatly, and when he smiled at the crowd, Mike saw his own childhood face reflected back. "Good evening, everyone," Lucas began, his voice clear and strong. "My name is Lucas Brewer, and I'd like to share a magic trick my dad taught me about making impossible things possible." Brewer. The name hit Mike like a physical blow. His son, his biological son, carried another man's name and claimed another man as his father, with uncomplicated love. Lucas spoke about David with casual reverence, children reserved for heroes they lived with every day. The magic trick was simple, a card trick involving mathematical probability, but Lucas performed it with showmanship of someone who'd been encouraged to shine. As he revealed the chosen card with a flourish, the audience erupted in applause, but Mike's attention was drawn to the third row where David Brewer stood, clapping with tears of pride in his eyes. "That's my boy," David said to the woman beside him. "He's been practicing for weeks. Wouldn't let me watch him rehearse. Said it had to be a surprise." Mike watched Lucas take his bow and scan the audience until his eyes found David's. The boy's entire face lit up with joy of successful performance, and he gave David an enthusiastic thumbs up that the man returned with equal enthusiasm. This was their moment, their shared triumph, their bond built through countless hours of practice and encouragement and presence. Next came Emma, and Mike's breath caught as his daughter walked to the microphone with a notebook clutched against her chest. She was smaller than Lucas, more delicate, with long dark hair in intricate braids that someone, Jessica, he assumed, had clearly spent time perfecting. She moved with careful grace, the kind of child who thought before she acted. "Hi," she began softly, then cleared her throat and tried again with more confidence. "My name is Emma Brewer, and I wrote a poem about families. It's called The Garden We Grew." She opened her notebook with ceremony and began to read. "Some flowers are planted in perfect rows, with sunshine planned and water scheduled. But the most beautiful gardens grow, where love decides what's needed. We weren't planted by the same gardener. Our seeds came from different places. But Mama's hands and Daddy's care taught us how to bloom in all spaces. Sarah came first, then us three, all different flowers in one garden. Now we're family, can't you see? Love chose us and we chose loving." The gymnasium fell completely silent as Emma finished, her young voice having delivered something profound about chosen family and deliberate love. Unexpected tears burned behind Mike's eyes as Jessica stood and began clapping, her face glowing with pride and perhaps recognition that her daughter had just articulated something beautiful about their unconventional journey to wholeness. David's reaction proved even more moving. The big man wiped his eyes unashamedly and mouthed, "I love you," to Emma, who beamed and gave him the same thumbs up Lucas had offered earlier. In the row beside them, 13-year-old Sarah, David's biological daughter, stood and cheered with the enthusiasm of a big sister who genuinely embraced her role in this blended family. "That's my sister," Sarah announced proudly. "She's going to be a famous poet someday." The casual way Sarah claimed Emma as her sister, the natural pride in her voice, the complete absence of any distinction between biological and chosen relationships, it all painted a picture of a family that had grown together organically, bound by daily choice rather than mere genetics. Then Sophie took the stage, and Mike's heart nearly stopped. His youngest daughter, and she was undeniably his, with his mother's stubborn chin and his sister's infectious energy, bounded to center stage with confidence that could only come from a lifetime of unconditional support. She wore a bright purple tutu over leggings and a sequined top that sparkled under the lights, her curly hair adorned with a small tiara. "I'm Sophie Brewer," she announced with projection that required no microphone. "And I'm going to dance to the song my daddy David plays for me every morning when he makes pancakes." David's face transformed with surprise and delight. Clearly, this was not the performance he'd expected, and his expression suggested Sophie had planned this tribute without anyone's knowledge. The music began, a gentle acoustic melody, and Sophie began to move with the kind of unselfconscious joy that belonged exclusively to children who'd never been told their enthusiasm was too much. She spun and leaped and twirled, her movements more heart than technique, but her smile so radiant that the entire audience found themselves smiling in response. "This song is special because my daddy David says it reminds him that every day with our family is like a celebration," Sophie announced mid-dance, hands on her hips with supreme confidence. She resumed dancing with even more enthusiasm, and Mike watched David cover his face with his hands, clearly overwhelmed by the public declaration of love. When Sophie finished with a dramatic curtsy, David stood and whistled through his fingers, shouting, "That's my daughter!" with unrestrained pride. During intermission, Mike watched the family interact with other parents and children, noting how naturally they moved as a unit. David carried Sophie on his shoulders while talking to another father about Little League. Jessica helped Emma fix a loose braid while discussing the school fundraiser with another mother. Lucas stayed close to Sarah, clearly viewing his older sister as a source of wisdom. Other families gravitated toward them with easy familiarity that spoke of genuine friendship rather than social obligation. Parents asked Jessica about military spouse support groups and thanked David for coaching soccer. Children hugged the triplets and included Sarah in their weekend plans. They were clearly a family that contributed to their community, that other people genuinely liked and respected. As the show ended and families began gathering belongings, Mike watched the Brewers make plans for ice cream, with each child lobbying for their preferred destination, while David pretended to seriously consider each choice. Jessica organized coats and backpacks with efficiency that spoke of years of practice, while Sarah helped corral the younger children. "Who wants to call Grandma Cat and tell her about tonight?" Jessica asked. "Me, me," Sophie bounced with excitement. "I want to tell her about my dance." "We can all talk to her," David said, lifting Sophie to his shoulders again. "She'll want to hear about Lucas's magic trick and Emma's poem, too." As the Brewer family walked toward the parking lot, Mike followed at a distance. He watched David buckle Sophie into her car seat, while Jessica helped Emma and Lucas with seat belts, saw Sarah climb into the front passenger seat with casual entitlement of the eldest child, observed the easy choreography of a family that had learned to move together efficiently. Before getting into the driver's seat, David turned back toward the school building, his eyes scanning the parking lot with automatic vigilance. For one heart-stopping moment, his gaze met Mike's across the dimly lit lot. David's expression registered recognition. He clearly knew who Mike was. But instead of anger or confrontation, Mike saw something that looked almost like pity. David raised his hand in a small, polite wave, the acknowledgement one might give to a distant acquaintance, then got into his car and drove away with Mike's family. Mike stood alone in the empty parking lot, finally understanding that love wasn't about biology or legal documents or original claims. Love was about showing up. It was about practicing magic tricks and braiding hair and making pancakes while singing. It was about attending every performance and celebrating every small triumph and creating safety in 100 daily ways. David Brewer had earned the title Daddy through 8 years of presence, patience, and unwavering commitment. Mike had forfeited any claim to that role through 8 years of absence, indifference, and the choice to build his wealth instead of his family. The children who carried his DNA called another man father, because that man had done the work of fathering, and they were better for it. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Bloomed. There are women who break under pressure, women who bend, and then there are women like Jessica, who transform pressure into diamonds and wear their strength like jewelry earned through fire. The community center on Maple Street buzzed with nervous energy on Saturday morning, filled with teenage girls carrying water bottles and wearing expressions ranging from excited determination to barely concealed terror. Mike sat in his car across the street, feeling like a stalker but unable to drive away from this glimpse into the woman Jessica had become. The banner hanging over the entrance read, "Strong Sisters Self-Defense Workshop, Building Confidence Through Knowledge," and underneath, Instructor, Captain Jessica Gomez Brewer. Even her name had evolved. She'd hyphenated it recently, probably in preparation for the wedding, creating a bridge between who she'd been and who she was becoming. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Jessica had learned to honor her journey while embracing her future, something he'd never mastered in all his years of running from commitments. Through the large windows, Mike could see Jessica setting up equipment with methodical precision that spoke of someone who approached everything with military thoroughness. She wore simple black workout clothes and had her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, but there was something about her posture, her movements, her very presence that commanded attention without demanding it. This was a woman who'd found her power and learned to wear it comfortably. Mike had researched this program during his obsessive investigation phase. Jessica had started these workshops 2 years ago, after a teenage military dependent had been assaulted off base. The incident had sparked outrage in the military community, but while others had organized protests and demanded policy changes, Jessica had quietly developed a practical response. These monthly workshops were always full, with waiting lists of young women eager to learn from someone who clearly understood what it meant to protect yourself in a world that didn't always protect you. The teenage girls gathered around her in a loose circle, representing a diverse mix of backgrounds and confidence levels. Mike recognized some from the files his investigator had provided. Daughters of military families, scholarship recipients from Jessica's mentorship programs, kids from the community center's after-school programs. "Good morning, warriors," Jessica began, her voice carrying easily through the space without strain. "Before we start learning how to protect our bodies, we're going to talk about protecting our minds and hearts. The strongest defense starts with knowing your own worth." Mike found himself leaning forward despite his distance, drawn by the natural authority in Jessica's voice. This wasn't the uncertain 20-year-old he'd married, the girl who'd looked to him for validation and direction. This was a woman who'd found her own compass and learned to trust it completely. "How many of you have ever been told you're too much of something?" Jessica asked the group. "Too loud, too emotional, too ambitious, too difficult?" Nearly every hand went up, and Mike saw Jessica nod with understanding. "I want you to remember this moment," she continued. "Every time someone tells you that you're too much, what they're really saying is that you're more than they know how to handle. That's not your problem to fix. That's their limitation to overcome." One of the younger girls raised her hand tentatively. "But what if it's your parents saying it, or teachers, people you're supposed to respect?" Jessica's expression softened with compassion as she crouched to the girl's eye level. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? When the people who should build us up are tearing us down. But here's what I learned. Respect is a two-way street. You can honor someone's position in your life while still protecting your own spirit. You can love people and refuse to let them diminish you." She stood and addressed the group again. "I was married when I was very young to someone who told me I was too much trouble when I got pregnant. He said I was too complicated for his simple life. For a long time, I believed him. I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, less inconvenient. But you know what I discovered?" The girls waited with rapt attention. The right people, those who deserve space in your life, will never ask you to be less than you are. They'll ask you to be more. They'll see your potential and challenge you to reach it. They'll love your complexity and celebrate your strength. Mike felt those words like a physical blow. He'd done exactly what Jessica described, asked her to be smaller, simpler, more convenient for his immature vision of what life should look like. The next hour was a master class in both physical techniques and psychological empowerment. Jessica demonstrated basic moves with one of the older girls, explaining not just how to break free from various holds, but why these techniques worked and when to use them. But more importantly, she wove life lessons throughout the instruction with the skill of someone who'd learned them through hard experience. If someone grabs your wrist like this, she demonstrated, you don't pull away from their strength. You attack their weakness. The thumb is always the weakest part of any grip. But this applies to more than physical situations. In life, when someone tries to control you, don't fight their strength head-on. Find the weakness in their argument, their logic, their hold on you. Mike watched transfixed as Jessica moved between students, correcting form with gentle encouragement, sharing stories that illustrated her points, building confidence with every interaction. She had a gift for making each girl feel seen and valued, for recognizing their individual struggles and addressing them with exactly the right combination of challenge and support. Emma's mom is so cool, he heard one teenager whisper to another during a water break. I wish my mom was half as awesome. She's not just Emma's mom anymore, the other girl replied. She's getting married to Major Brewer next month. My sister says it's going to be the biggest wedding Fort Braxton has ever seen, because everyone loves them. And she runs all these programs for military families, like she's basically famous on base for helping people. The casual mention of his daughter, the excitement about the upcoming wedding, the obvious admiration these young women had for Jessica, it all reinforced how completely his absence had been filled by people who deserved the space they occupied in her life. During a water break, Jessica sat with the girls in a circle, and the conversation turned personal. One of the older teenagers raised her hand hesitantly. Captain Brewer? How did you know Major Brewer was the right person to marry, after your first marriage ended so badly? Mike expected deflection, but Jessica considered the question seriously. That's a really important question, she said finally. My first marriage failed because I was very young, and I confused intensity with love, potential with reality. I thought if I just loved someone hard enough, I could make them want the same things I wanted. She paused, looking around the circle. David and I work because we started as friends first. I got to see how he handled stress, how he treated people when he thought no one was watching, how he responded to my children's needs before he had any obligation to care about them. I saw him be a father to his own daughter, and I knew exactly what kind of parent and partner he was before I ever let myself fall in love with him. So you waited? Another girl asked. I took my time, Jessica corrected gently. There's a difference. Waiting suggests you're sitting around hoping someone else will change your life. Taking your time means you're building your own life and only letting people in who add value to what you've already created. What about forgiveness? One of the younger girls asked. My mom says I have to forgive my dad even though he left us. Jessica's expression grew thoughtful. Forgiveness is complicated. I think there's a difference between forgiving someone and letting them back into your life. You can release anger for your own peace without opening your door to someone who's shown you they can't be trusted with your heart. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending something didn't happen. Did you forgive your first husband? The girl pressed. Jessica was quiet for a long moment. I forgave the boy he was. I forgave his immaturity and his fear and his inability to handle responsibility. But I didn't forget what I learned about the kind of person I needed in my life. Forgiveness healed my heart, but wisdom protected my future. Near the end of the session, one of the girls asked Jessica about her military service. I joined the military because I needed structure and purpose, Jessica explained. I was 20 years old with 3 babies and no clear path forward. The military gave me a framework for building the life I wanted, and it taught me that strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you develop through facing challenges you don't think you can handle. Were you scared? One girl asked. Terrified, Jessica admitted with a laugh. Basic training was 8 weeks away from my babies when they were barely out of diapers. I cried myself to sleep for the first week, but I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done even when you're scared. What about now? Another girl asked. Are you scared about getting married again? Jessica's face lit up with a smile that transformed her completely. Not even a little bit. When you find someone who loves all the parts of you, including the parts you thought were too much, marriage becomes a celebration rather than a risk. David has seen me at my worst and chosen to love me anyway. The workshop ended with the girls practicing their techniques one final time, then gathering for a group photo. As they prepared to leave, several girls lingered to talk with Jessica privately, clearly seeking advice on personal situations. As the last girl left, Jessica began cleaning up equipment with the same methodical precision she'd used to set it up. Mike knew he should drive away, but he found himself getting out of his car and walking toward the building. Jessica looked up as he approached the open doors, her expression registering recognition but no surprise. She continued packing equipment with calm efficiency, neither welcoming nor dismissing his presence. The girls seemed to enjoy the workshop, Mike said awkwardly. They're good kids, Jessica replied without looking up. Smart, strong, just need someone to remind them of what they already know about themselves. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Jessica, Mike began, then stopped, unsure what he'd intended to say. She straightened and looked at him directly for the first time, her expression calm but unreadable. Mike, she said simply, is there something you need? The question was polite but distant, the tone one might use with a stranger asking for directions. There was no anger in her voice, but there was also no warmth, no recognition of shared history. Mike looked at this woman he'd once been married to, seeing clearly who she'd become and what he'd lost. Jessica had transformed herself into someone extraordinary, a leader, a protector, a woman who built strength in others because she'd learned to build it in herself. No, he said finally, understanding that there truly was nothing he needed from her, nothing he could offer her. I'm glad you're happy. Jessica studied his face for a moment, then nodded once. I am, she said simply. Very happy. She returned to her packing, and Mike understood that he'd been dismissed, not cruelly, but completely. He walked back to his car with the strange sensation of having witnessed his own irrelevance, finally understanding that Jessica's greatest victory wasn't anything she'd done to him, but everything she'd done without him. She'd bloomed in his absence, grown into someone magnificent, not despite his abandonment, but because of what it had taught her about her own strength. Chapter 5. Love That Waited. Real love, Mike learned from watching David Brewer, wasn't about timing or chemistry or grand gestures. It was about consistency, showing up every day to earn a place in someone's life rather than demanding it as a right. The Fort Braxton Officers Club was transformed for the spring military ball, its utilitarian walls draped in gold and navy blue, tables arranged around a dance floor that reflected the sparkle of dress uniforms and evening gowns. Mike had gained entry through a military contractor connection, telling himself he needed to understand professional networking opportunities, but knowing he was here to torture himself with another glimpse of the life he'd forfeited. He stationed himself at the bar with whiskey he didn't want, watching couples move across the dance floor in the traditional waltz that opened every military ball. His eyes found Jessica and David immediately, drawn to them with magnetic pull. The scene before him was like watching a fairy tale come to life. Military couples filled the dance floor in perfect formation, their movements synchronized not just with the music, but with years of shared experiences, deployments survived, relocations managed, challenges overcome together. These people understood commitment in ways Mike had never learned, their relationships tested by circumstances far more demanding than anything he'd ever faced in his comfortable civilian life. Jessica wore a deep emerald gown that complemented her dark skin beautifully, her hair swept up in an elegant chignon that revealed the graceful line of her neck. But her expression stopped Mike's breath. She radiated happiness, glowing from within with the kind of joy that came from deep security and genuine love. This wasn't the nervous, eager-to-please girl he'd married, constantly seeking approval and validation. This was a woman who knew her own worth and had found someone who cherished it. David moved with surprising grace for his size, guiding Jessica through the steps with attentiveness that spoke of a partner who'd taken time to learn dancing because it mattered to her. His dress uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect. But what struck Mike most was his expression as he looked at Jessica. Pure adoration mixed with something deeper, a reverence that suggested he never took this gift for granted. "They're beautiful together, aren't they?" Mike turned to find an older woman beside him at the bar, her dress uniform indicating senior officer rank. She was watching Jessica and David with fond expression. "Colonel Patricia Morrison," she introduced herself. "I'm Jessica's commanding officer, and you are—" "Mike Purinen," he replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving his real name. Colonel Morrison's expression shifted slightly, recognition dawning. "Ah," she said quietly. "I see." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them as they watched the dancing couples. "Would you like to know what I see when I look at them?" she asked finally. Mike wasn't sure he did, but he nodded anyway. "I see a man who fell in love with a woman's strength rather than her vulnerability," Colonel Morrison said. "Most men are attracted to Jessica's beauty or intimidated by her competence. David was drawn to both and never saw them as contradictory." She sipped her wine and continued. "I've watched a lot of military relationships over the years. Too many fail because one person expects the other to be smaller, quieter, more convenient. David has only ever asked Jessica to be more herself." Mike watched David spin Jessica gently, then draw her back with a smile that lit up his entire face. When Jessica laughed at something he whispered, the sound carried across the dance floor with infectious joy. "They met during a crisis," Colonel Morrison continued. "Emergency deployment, both scrambling to arrange childcare. David's wife had died in childbirth 2 years earlier. Jessica was managing triplets alone. They ended up sharing babysitting duties out of necessity." Mike found himself listening, despite the pain of hearing how completely he'd been replaced. For months, they were just friends. David would pick up Jessica's kids from daycare when she had late meetings. Jessica would take Sarah for sleepovers when David had field exercises. They were both so focused on being good parents that they almost missed falling in love. "What changed?" Mike asked, surprising himself. Colonel Morrison smiled. "Sarah changed it, David's daughter. She was about 11, and she asked her father why he didn't marry Jessica, since she made him smile more than anyone else had since her mother died." Mike watched David lead Jessica through complex steps, their synchronization speaking of countless hours of practice. David waited 2 years after that conversation before he even asked Jessica on a date, Colonel Morrison continued. 2 years of friendship, of showing her through actions that he could be trusted with her heart and her children's security. He understood that Jessica needed to see who he really was in every situation before she could risk loving again. The song ended, and Mike watched David bow formally to Jessica, who curtsied in response with playful elegance. When they embraced, Mike saw David whisper something that made Jessica's face light up with pure happiness. When he finally did ask her out, Colonel Morrison said, Jessica told him she needed to think about it. Not because she didn't care about him, but because she had 4 children to consider, her 3 and his Sarah. She couldn't afford to make a mistake that would hurt them. Mike remembered Jessica's tendency to overthink decisions during their marriage, how he'd found her caution irritating and her need for security immature. Now he understood it differently. She'd been protecting not just herself, but the children who depended on her judgment. David's response was perfect, the colonel continued. He told her to take all the time she needed, that he'd rather wait for the right decision than rush into the wrong one. Then he kept showing up, not as a suitor, but as a friend. He coached Lucas's Little League team, helped Emma with her science project, taught Sophie to ride a bike. He proved himself worthy of their trust before he ever asked for Jessica's heart. A new song began, and Mike watched other couples join the dance floor. But his attention remained fixed on Jessica and David, noting how they moved together with easy synchronization of people who'd learned to anticipate each other's needs. You know what impressed me most about their courtship? Colonel Morrison added. David never tried to replace the children's memories of their early years or pretend he'd always been there. He honored Jessica's journey as a single mother, acknowledged her strength in raising them alone, and simply asked if he could be part of their future. That kind of humility is rare in men, especially in our community where ego often runs high. The man Jessica was married to before, Colonel Morrison said carefully, he left when she needed him most. David has done the opposite. He's shown up for every moment, large and small. Mike felt those words like individual cuts. Every act of service David had performed was something Mike should have done. What about Sarah? Mike asked. David's daughter. How did she handle sharing her father? Sarah was the one who suggested David propose. She told him that Jessica and the triplets weren't taking him away from her. They were giving her the big family she'd always wanted. Mike looked around the ballroom and spotted Sarah at a table with the triplets, all 4 children clearly comfortable together, sharing dessert and giggling at some private joke. They're siblings in every way that matters, Colonel Morrison observed. David didn't just gain a wife when he married Jessica. He gained 3 more children who adore him. The song changed to something more contemporary, and Mike watched Jessica and David adapt their dancing style effortlessly. They laughed together as David attempted a move clearly outside his comfort zone, Jessica encouraging him with patient good humor. I've seen a lot of second marriages in the military, Colonel Morrison said. Too many fail because people are trying to recreate what they lost or fix what went wrong the first time. Jessica and David succeeded because they built something entirely new together. David proposed last Christmas, Colonel Morrison said with a smile. Not just to Jessica, but to all 4 children. He had individual rings for each of them. He asked Jessica to marry him, but he asked the children if they wanted to be his family officially. What did the children say? Mike asked. Sophie said yes before David finished the question. Colonel Morrison laughed. Emma asked if she could call him Daddy. Lucas wanted to know if this meant David would adopt them legally. Sarah cried happy tears and said she'd been waiting for this family to make it official. As the evening wound down, Mike watched the Brewer family gather their belongings with practiced efficiency. David carried a sleeping Sophie while Jessica collected Sarah's sweater and Lucas's forgotten program. Emma helped Sarah gather flowers from centerpieces, chattering about pressing them in books as keepsakes. As they walked toward the exit, David's arm went automatically around Jessica's waist, and she leaned into him with unconscious trust. The children surrounded them in a protective bubble of family warmth, Sarah and Emma giggling while Lucas held David's hand. Mike followed them outside at a distance, watching as they loaded into a large SUV that accommodated their family of 6. Through the windows, he could see David helping with seatbelts, while Jessica distributed water bottles. As David started the engine, Mike heard Sophie's sleepy voice asking, "Daddy David, can we have pancakes tomorrow?" "Of course, Princess," David replied. "What kind do you want?" "The ones with faces. And can Lucas help?" "Absolutely. We'll make a pancake family." The car pulled away, taking with it the laughter and love that Mike had forfeited through his own choices. He stood alone in the parking lot, finally understanding that David Brewer hadn't stolen his family. David had rescued it, piece by piece, through the kind of patient, consistent love that builds unshakable foundations. Mike had given Jessica reasons to doubt love. David had given her reasons to trust it again. And in doing so, David had earned something Mike never could: the absolute security of knowing he'd chosen wisely and been chosen in return. Chapter 6. Grandmother's Heart. Sometimes the most profound betrayals come not from enemies, but from the people whose love you've taken for granted, who choose to redirect their loyalty towards someone more deserving of the gift you've squandered. Catherine Purinen had been Mike's mother for 36 years, but sitting across from him in the elegant restaurant she'd chosen for their monthly lunch, she looked at him with the disappointed expression of a woman who no longer recognized the man she'd raised. At 72, Catherine remained formidable, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the kind of moral clarity that came from a lifetime of watching people's choices reveal their character. "You look terrible, Michael," she said without preamble as their server brought water and menus. "When's the last time you slept properly?" Mike rubbed his eyes, aware that the past weeks of obsessive research had taken their toll. "I've been busy with work, Mom." "No," Catherine said firmly, setting down her menu with more force than necessary. "I don't know how it is, because the son I raised understood that some things matter more than profit margins. That boy seems to have disappeared." Her words carried weight that suggested this conversation had been brewing longer than Mike realized. Catherine ordered her usual salad without consulting the menu, her attention focused entirely on her son, with the intensity of someone preparing for a difficult discussion. The waitress retreated quickly, clearly sensing the tension at the table. "I hired a private investigator," Mike said, deciding honesty might forestall whatever lecture was coming. "I know about Jessica, about the children, about everything." Catherine's reaction wasn't surprise, it was relief. "Good," she said simply. "Then you know what you've missed, what you chose to miss." "Mom, I was 25 when I left Jessica. I wasn't ready for—" "Stop!" Catherine's voice cut through his explanation with surgical precision. "I've heard your excuses for 8 years, Michael, and I'm tired of pretending they make sense." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick photo album, placing it on the table between them. The cover was decorated with children's handwriting. For Grandma Cat, Love Emma, Lucas, Sophie, and Sarah. "They made this for me last Christmas," Catherine said, her voice softening as she opened to the first page. "Look at what you've missed, Michael." Really look. The first photo showed 3 babies in matching Christmas outfits, perhaps 6 months old, sitting with Jessica's great-aunt, Rosa. The babies had chubby cheeks and bright eyes, and even in infancy, Mike could see traces of his own features. "Jessica never contacted me after you left," Catherine said, turning the page to show toddler pictures. "She was too proud, probably too hurt. I spent 3 years wondering about my grandchildren, knowing they existed but having no idea how to find them without betraying your confidence about wanting a clean break." Mike winced at his own words, thrown back at him now with the weight of consequence. "Last year, I couldn't stand it anymore," Catherine continued. "I hired my own investigator and found them. Did you know Jessica never told them your name? They knew they had a birth father who went away, but she protected you even in your absence." The photos progressed through the years. First steps, birthday parties, school pictures, Christmas mornings. Mike saw his children growing up surrounded by love and laughter and security he'd never provided. In many of the later photos, David appeared, clearly comfortable with the children, obviously part of their family. "That's David," Catherine said, noticing Mike's attention. "Major David Brewer, the man who stepped into the space you vacated and became the father these children needed." "You know him?" Mike asked, surprised by the fondness in his mother's voice. "I know him very well," Catherine replied, her voice softening in a way it rarely did when she spoke about people outside the family. "He's become the son-in-law I never expected, and the father figure these children deserved. When I finally contacted Jessica, she could have refused to let me into their lives. She had every right to protect her family from further hurt. Instead, she welcomed me with a grace I'm not sure I deserved." Catherine turned to recent photos showing her actively involved in his children's lives. Catherine teaching Emma to knit, while both of them laughed at some shared joke. Catherine and Lucas building a birdhouse together, their faces serious with concentration. Catherine pushing Sophie on a swing while the little girl laughed with pure joy, her head thrown back in abandon. "They call me Grandma Cat," Catherine said with a smile that transformed her face completely. Sophie couldn't pronounce Catherine when they first met. "Do you know what it's like, Michael, to have grandchildren run to hug you when you walk in the door? To have them excited to show you their artwork and tell you about their day? To feel genuinely needed and loved without having to earn it through gifts or guilt?" Mike stared at the photos, seeing his mother experiencing the grandparent relationship he denied her through his own choices. "Jessica could have kept them from me out of anger," Catherine said. "She could have made me pay for your sins. Instead, she gave me one of the greatest gifts of my life, the chance to know my grandchildren." "How often do you see them?" Mike asked quietly. "Every other weekend. Sometimes more. I attend their school events, help with homework, babysit when Jessica and David need date nights. I'm part of their family now, Michael. Really part of it." She turned to a photo that made Mike's chest tighten. Catherine sitting around a dinner table with Jessica, David, and all 4 children, everyone laughing. They looked like a complete family, with his mother seamlessly integrated into their dynamic. "David treats me like his own mother," Catherine said softly. "He asks my advice about the children, includes me in family decisions. Jessica and I bake together every Sunday after church. I have the grandparent relationship I always dreamed of, Michael, just not with the family I expected." "You go to church with them?" Mike asked. "Every Sunday. St. Matthew's on Elm Street. Jessica and David are very involved in the congregation. The children sing in the choir, participate in youth programs, have a whole community of people who love and support them." Mike felt cold understanding settle in his stomach. His mother had not only found his children, she'd become part of their extended community, their support system, their weekly routine. "You could have told me," Mike said, hearing the hurt in his own voice. "To what?" Catherine interrupted sharply. "To disrupt their lives again? To confuse children who've found stability? To upset a family that functions beautifully without you?" She leaned forward, her expression intense. "Michael, I watched Jessica struggle as a young single mother. I've seen the woman she's become through determination and strength. I've watched David love those children as his own from the moment he met them. Why would I risk damaging something so precious to give you another chance to run away?" "I'm not the same person I was 8 years ago," Mike protested. "Aren't you?" Catherine asked quietly. "Because from where I sit, you're still making the same choices, still putting your comfort above everyone else's needs, still expecting other people to accommodate your timeline and feelings." She turned to a recent photo of the children at what appeared to be a birthday party, their faces bright with excitement, while Jessica and David watched with pure parental pride. Do you know what Emma told me last week? Catherine asked. She said she feels sorry for children whose parents aren't as happy as hers are. At 8 years old, she's learned that not every family has the kind of love and security she takes for granted. These children don't need another disappointment in their lives. Jessica doesn't need the chaos of wondering whether you'll stay or leave again. David doesn't need to worry about someone undermining the family he spent years building. And frankly, I don't think you're ready to be the kind of man who deserves space in their world. What would it take? Mike asked quietly. What would I need to do to earn that space? Catherine studied his face for a long moment. First, you'd need to understand that this isn't about you getting something you want. It's about you having something valuable to offer them. What could you bring to their lives that would make their world better, not just different? Mike had no immediate answer. Second, you'd need to prove that commitment through years of consistent action, not grand gestures. These children have learned to trust David because he's shown up for every small moment. Could you do that? Again, Mike found himself without a response. The wedding is next month, Catherine said quietly. I'll be walking Jessica down the aisle because you're not part of her story anymore. I'll be watching David officially become the father of your children because he's earned that role through 8 years of devotion. She reached across the table and covered Mike's hand with her own. I hope someday you build something meaningful with your life, Michael, but these children already have everything they need. Their lives are complete and beautiful and stable. Your role now is to protect that, even if it means protecting it from yourself. Catherine gathered her purse and stood to leave. If you truly love them, if you have any real affection for the woman you once married, you'll let them be happy. You'll let them keep the family they've built without the shadow of your regret complicating their joy. She paused at his shoulder. Grandma Cat loves you, Michael, but she loves them more, and she's learned that sometimes love means choosing who deserves your loyalty. Mike sat alone at the table long after his mother left, staring at the space where the photo album had been, finally understanding that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt because the people on the other side had learned to live beautifully without them. Chapter 7. The Proposal's Answer. There are moments that divide time into before and after, and Mike was about to witness one that would cement his permanent place in the before of Jessica's story. The May evening was perfect for an outdoor ceremony, with golden sunlight filtering through ancient oak trees and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming jasmine across the Fort Braxton Community Garden. Mike sat in his rental car at the edge of the parking lot, hidden behind a maintenance building, watching the most beautiful ending to a love story he'd helped create through his own absence. 60 people had gathered in the garden's central clearing, where strings of white lights hung between ancient oaks and simple wooden chairs formed a circle around a small gazebo draped with flowing white fabric. This wasn't the elaborate military ceremony Mike expected, but something more intimate and personal, a celebration that reflected Jessica and David's preference for meaningful over magnificent. The guests represented the life Jessica had built. Military families from the base, neighbors from their community, elderly members from St. Matthew's Church, teenagers from Jessica's self-defense workshops, and colleagues who'd become friends through years of shared service. Everyone present had a genuine connection to the couple, creating an atmosphere of authentic joy rather than obligatory attendance. Mike recognized some faces from his surveillance of their lives. Colonel Morrison in her dress uniform, the elderly woman from the gala who'd spoken so warmly about the family, several of the teenage girls from Jessica's workshops, now dressed in their finest clothes and carrying small bouquets as honorary flower girls. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a community celebration of two people who'd touched countless lives through their service and love. David stood beneath the gazebo in his dress uniform, but his military bearing couldn't hide the nervous energy radiating from him. At 34, David had the kind of solid, dependable handsomeness that suggested he'd age well, but it was his expression that transformed him from merely attractive to genuinely compelling. This was a man who understood exactly how fortunate he was about to become. The children sat in the front row, all four dressed in coordinating outfits that managed to look formal without appearing uncomfortable. Sarah, now 13 and poised, wore a simple navy dress and held a small bouquet of white roses. The triplets, Lucas in a small suit, Emma in a pale yellow dress with elaborate braids, and Sophie in pink tulle, sat with barely contained excitement of children who knew they were part of something special. Catherine sat directly behind the children, elegant in a soft gray dress, her silver hair perfectly styled and her eyes bright with tears. She kept reaching forward to smooth Sophie's hair or straighten Lucas's tie, her grandmother's heart clearly overflowing with joy. The music began. Not a traditional wedding march, but something softer and more personal, played by a small string quartet. Jessica appeared at the edge of the clearing, and Mike's breath caught in his throat. She wore her grandmother's vintage wedding dress, a simple design in ivory silk, tailored to fit her perfectly. The dress was elegant rather than elaborate, with three-quarter sleeves and a modest neckline that suggested timeless grace. Her dark hair was swept into a loose chignon with small white flowers tucked behind one ear, and she carried a bouquet of white roses and jasmine. But it wasn't the dress or flowers that made Mike's chest tighten. It was Jessica's expression. She glowed with the kind of happiness that came from absolute certainty, from knowing without doubt that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person. Catherine rose and moved to Jessica's side, taking her arm with practiced grace. Jessica smiled at the older woman with genuine affection, leaning into her slightly as they prepared to walk down the aisle. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Catherine said. "Thank you for being here," Jessica replied softly. "For being part of this. It means everything." They began walking slowly down the aisle, Jessica's steps measured and graceful, Catherine's expression radiating pride. The guests rose as they passed, faces glowing with affection for a couple whose love story had touched everyone who'd witnessed it. Mike's attention shifted to David, whose reaction to seeing Jessica was everything a proposal should be. The big man's face transformed with wonder and gratitude, his eyes filling with tears he didn't try to hide. David wasn't just watching his bride approach. He was watching his entire future walk toward him. When Jessica and Catherine reached the gazebo, Catherine kissed Jessica's cheek gently, then turned to David and spoke quietly. "Take good care of my daughter." "Always," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Always." Jessica stepped forward to take David's hands, and the officiant, a military chaplain who clearly knew them both, began the ceremony. "We gather today to witness the marriage of Jessica and David," he began, "two people who found each other not in the easy seasons of life, but in the challenging ones. They built their love on the foundation of friendship, tested it through the demands of military service and parenthood, and strengthened it through choosing each other every day for 4 years. Jessica and David have asked to write their own vows," the chaplain continued, "because they wanted their promises to reflect the specific love they've built together." David went first, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket with trembling hands. "Jessica," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, "when I met you 4 years ago, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought it was what I'd had with Maria, and I believed that kind of love only came once in a lifetime." He paused, looking directly into Jessica's eyes with such intensity that even Mike could feel the power of that connection from his hiding place across the parking lot. "You taught me that love isn't finite or limited. You showed me that hearts expand to hold more, not less. You didn't ask me to replace what I'd lost. You helped me build something new and different and equally beautiful. Mike felt those words like physical blows, understanding that David was describing exactly what Mike had been too immature to do. Build something new rather than trying to recreate an idealized past or run from responsibility altogether. You trusted me with your children before you trusted me with your heart, David continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. And that taught me the most important lesson of my life, that being a parent isn't about biology or obligation. It's about showing up every day and choosing to love consistently, even when it's hard, even when you're tired, even when the world seems too complicated to navigate. David's voice carried across the garden with the kind of conviction that comes from lived experience rather than romantic idealism. Emma, Lucas, and Sophie became my children not through law or ceremony, but through bedtime stories and scraped knees and homework help and 1,000 small moments of learning to be their dad. Sarah gained not just a stepmother, but 3 siblings who adore her, and a woman who taught her that families can grow without anyone being diminished or forgotten. So today I promise you this, David said, his voice rising with certainty. I promise to love you not just in the easy moments, but in the difficult ones. I promise to be the kind of father your children deserve, and the kind of husband who makes your life richer, not harder. I promise to choose you and choose our family every single day, because that's what real love does. It chooses and keeps choosing, forever. The garden fell silent except for gentle weeping from guests moved by the sincerity of David's vows. Jessica wiped tears from her eyes, her smile radiant with joy. Then it was Jessica's turn. David, she began, 4 years ago I thought I was broken. I thought my ability to trust, to hope, to believe in partnership had been damaged beyond repair. Mike felt those words like a knife to his chest, understanding that he'd been the one who'd convinced Jessica she was broken. You didn't try to fix me, Jessica continued, because you never saw me as broken. You saw me as strong, as capable, as someone worth waiting for while I learned to trust again. Her voice grew stronger. You became my children's father not by replacing someone else, but by creating that role fresh and new. You earned their love through consistency and patience and daily devotion that builds unshakable security. Mike watched David's face transform with emotion as Jessica continued. So today I promise you this. I promise to continue building the life we've created together, choice by choice, day by day. I promise to love you not just for who you are now, but for who you're still becoming. I promise to choose you every single day, not because it's easy, but because you're worth the choice. Her voice rang with absolute certainty. Because what we've built together is worth protecting and nurturing and celebrating. Because you're not just the love of my life, you're the life I choose to live. The exchange of rings was simple but profound, each placing matching bands on the other's finger while speaking words of commitment. Mike noticed that all 4 children had matching rings as well, family rings that symbolized their inclusion in this covenant. By the power vested in me, the chaplain declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife. David, you may kiss your bride. David cupped Jessica's face gently and kissed her with tender reverence that spoke of a man who understood exactly how precious his gift was. The kiss was neither theatrical nor brief. It was the kiss of 2 people sealing a promise they intended to keep forever. The garden erupted in applause and cheers, with the children leaping to their feet and clapping with uninhibited joy. Sophie bounced up and down while Emma wiped happy tears, and Lucas whistled through his fingers the way David had taught him. Sarah threw her arms around Catherine, both of them crying and laughing simultaneously. As the newlyweds turned to face their guests, their faces glowing with happiness, the children rushed forward to embrace them. David lifted Sophie into his arms while Jessica hugged Emma and Lucas, and Sarah joined the group hug that became a tangle of arms and laughter and pure familial joy. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chaplain announced with a smile, "I present to you the Brewer family." The guests rose in a standing ovation that went on for several minutes, celebrating not just a marriage but the completion of a family that had been years in the making. Mike watched through tears he hadn't expected as his children, no longer his children, but David's children, celebrated their official transition into a family that had chosen them completely. As the guests began moving toward the reception area, Mike saw Jessica and David steal a private moment together. David wrapped his arms around his wife and whispered something that made her laugh and lean into him with complete trust and contentment. They were surrounded by people who loved them, celebrating a love that had been tested and proven worthy. They had 4 children who adored them, a community that supported them, and the kind of partnership that would weather any storm. Mike started his car and drove away slowly, understanding that he'd just witnessed the final chapter of a story that had begun with his own failures, but had been completed by 2 people who'd learned how to love properly. Jessica and David had created something beautiful from the wreckage he'd left behind, and their happiness was both complete and completely independent of anything he might do or say. The woman who'd once begged him not to leave had become someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to thrive, and the children he'd rejected had found a father who'd chosen them completely, giving them the security and love they deserved. Chapter 8. Wedding Dreams. Joy, Mike discovered, was a language he'd never learned to speak fluently, and watching others converse in it with native ease revealed the poverty of his own emotional vocabulary. The reception unfolded like a perfectly choreographed celebration of community and love, transforming the Fort Braxton Community Center into something magical with simple decorations and abundant genuine affection. White tablecloths, mason jars filled with wildflowers, and strings of lights created an atmosphere that was elegant without pretension, a reflection of Jessica and David's preference for substance over show. Mike had moved his surveillance position to a medical office parking lot across the street, using binoculars to observe from a distance that felt both necessary and pathetic. He told himself he was protecting Jessica's happiness by maintaining his absence, but the truth was more complicated. He was addicted to witnessing the life he'd forfeited, unable to look away from the completeness he'd made possible through his own departure. The head table sat Jessica and David at the center, flanked by their 4 children and Catherine, creating a visual representation of the family they'd built together. Sarah sat beside her new stepmother with easy comfort of a relationship that had developed naturally over years. The triplets chatted animatedly with their parents and sister, their faces glowing with security of children who'd never doubted their place in their family's hierarchy. Catherine held court as the honorary grandmother, clearly delighted with her role in this celebration. Mike watched her help Sophie cut her cake, assist Lucas with his napkin, and listen attentively as Emma described something with animated gestures. His mother had found the family she'd always wanted, and her contentment was visible from across the street. The scene reminded Mike of paintings he'd seen in museums, the wedding feast or family celebration, where artists captured moments of pure human joy and connection. But those were static images, frozen in time. This was living art, a family writing their story in real time, creating memories that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The speeches began after dinner. David's best man, Major Rodriguez, spoke about watching his friend transform from a grief-stricken widower into a man radiating happiness. He shared stories about David's devotion to Sarah, his patience in courting Jessica, and his natural transition into fatherhood for 3 additional children. "I've served with David for 6 years," Rodriguez said, "and I've never seen him as confident and complete as he's been since Jessica and the kids came into his life. They didn't just give him a family, they gave him his purpose back." Mike watched David's reaction, seeing the big man wipe his eyes without embarrassment while Jessica reached over to squeeze his hand supportively. Jessica's matron of honor was Colonel Morrison, who spoke about watching Jessica transform from a young single mother struggling to balance military service with parenthood into a confident leader who'd found the perfect partner. Jessica Brewer represents everything admirable about military families, Colonel Morrison said, using Jessica's new married name with obvious pleasure. She's proven that strength and vulnerability can coexist, that independence and partnership can enhance each other. But it was Catherine's speech that broke Mike's heart completely. His 72-year-old mother stood with confidence, looking around the room with satisfaction of someone surrounded by people she loved. 8 years ago, Catherine began, her voice strong despite her tears, I thought I'd lost my chance to be a grandmother. I thought I'd never experience the joy of children running to hug me, never get to attend school plays or help with homework or spoil little ones with too much candy. She paused, looking directly at Jessica and David with an expression of profound gratitude. Then I found this family, or perhaps they found me. Jessica welcomed me with a generosity I'm not sure I deserved, and David treated me like his own mother from our first meeting. These 4 children gave me a reason to believe in the future again. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she continued, and Mike could see tears glistening in the eyes of guests who understood they were witnessing something profound. You know, people talk about blood being thicker than water, but I've learned something different in this past year. Love is thicker than blood, choice is stronger than genetics, and family, real family, is built through daily acts of kindness, patience, and showing up for each other when showing up is hard. She raised her champagne glass and the entire room fell silent. So tonight, I toast not just Jessica and David's marriage, but the completion of a family that was built through patience, commitment, and the radical choice to love generously. May you continue to be each other's soft place, to land and each other's inspiration, to soar. The room erupted in applause, and Mike watched his mother embraced by Jessica, kissed by David, and mobbed by 4 children who clearly adored their grandmother. The dancing began with Jessica and David's first dance as husband and wife, moving together to a song that clearly held special meaning. They danced with comfortable synchronization of people who'd learned to move through life together, David leading gently while Jessica followed naturally, both talking quietly and laughing at private jokes. When the father-daughter dance was announced, Mike watched as both David and Jessica took the floor with their children. David danced with Emma first, holding her hands while she stood on his feet, both laughing as he guided her through a simple waltz. Jessica danced with Lucas, who concentrated intensely on not stepping on her dress. Then David lifted Sophie into his arms and spun her around while she giggled with pure delight, and Jessica took Sarah's hands for a dance that spoke of the strong relationship they'd built as stepmother and daughter. Finally, all 6 family members joined together on the dance floor, creating a memory the children would carry for the rest of their lives. As the evening progressed, Mike observed the easy dynamics of extended family and chosen community. Jessica's colleagues mingled with David's military friends. Neighbors chatted with elderly church members. Teenagers from Jessica's workshops posed for photos with the bride and groom. Everyone present had a genuine connection to the couple. The children moved freely between tables, comfortable with all the adults present, clearly viewing the entire guest list as extended family. Mike watched Lucas explain something scientific to one of David's colleagues, while Emma showed her latest poem to Colonel Morrison, and Sophie charmed elderly church members with her uninhibited personality. The cake-cutting ceremony was simple but meaningful, with Jessica and David feeding each other small bites while the children cheered. When Sophie asked if she could have the first piece, David immediately agreed, lifting her up so she could blow out the single candle while making a wish for our family to be happy forever. Mike watched the children help serve cake to guests, their faces glowing with the importance of having roles in their parents' celebration. They moved with confidence of children who'd never doubted their place in the hierarchy of love. As the evening wound down and guests began saying goodbyes, Mike observed the family dynamics that would continue long after the celebration. Jessica and David moved together with practiced efficiency of parents who'd learned to manage logistics while maintaining connection. Catherine gathered the children's belongings while making plans for a sleepover, giving the newlyweds their wedding night privacy. The final dance was for family only, Jessica and David swaying slowly while their 4 children danced around them, and Catherine watched with her hands pressed to her heart. Mike watched through his binoculars as this family celebrated their official beginning, their legal recognition, their public commitment to choosing each other every day going forward. When the music ended and the family began gathering their belongings, Mike saw Jessica pause to look around the community center one last time. Her expression was one of complete satisfaction. Someone who'd celebrated exactly the way she'd wanted to, with exactly the people who mattered most. David appeared beside her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. Mike couldn't hear what he whispered, but Jessica's response was to lean back against him with complete trust of someone who'd found her safe harbor. As the Brewer family loaded into their vehicles, Catherine taking the children for their promised sleepover, Jessica and David heading to their honeymoon suite, Mike realized he'd witnessed the completion of something that had begun with his own failure, but had been perfected by 2 people who'd learned how to love properly. Jessica had transformed his abandonment into strength, his rejection into resilience, his absence into an opportunity for someone worthy to step into the space he'd vacated. David had earned the title of husband and father through years of presence, patience, and unwavering commitment. Their happiness was complete and completely independent of anything Mike might do or say. They'd built something beautiful from the wreckage he'd left behind, and their joy was both genuine and well-deserved. Mike drove home to his empty penthouse, finally understanding that some stories aren't about redemption or second chances. Sometimes they're about other people's triumphs, growing from the fertile soil of your own mistakes. About love stories that begin where your own story ended. About families that become whole, precisely because you had the wisdom, or the failure, to step out of their way. Jessica Brewer had found her happy ending, and Mike Puranen had played his essential role by providing the before that made her after so much sweeter. Chapter 9. Crisis Reveals Truth. Emergency rooms have a way of stripping away pretense and revealing the architecture of people's hearts, who they call first, whose comfort they seek, whose presence makes the unbearable bearable. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late May, 3 weeks after the wedding. Mike jerked awake to his phone, buzzing insistently, the sound cutting through his alcohol-induced sleep like a blade. Catherine's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, Mike's heart stopped. His 72-year-old mother calling at this hour could only mean crisis. "Michael?" Catherine's voice was tight with controlled panic, the kind of forced calm that comes from years of managing emergencies while keeping others steady. "You need to know. Lucas is in the hospital, emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix. I thought you should know." Mike was out of bed before she finished speaking, his mind instantly clear despite the late hour and the whiskey he'd consumed, trying to forget the wedding images that haunted his thoughts. "What hospital? How is he?" "St. Mary's. The same hospital where they were born." Catherine's voice cracked slightly, and Mike realized this was probably the first time in years he'd heard his mother sound truly frightened. "It's bad, Michael. He waited too long to tell anyone he was in pain. You know how he is. Didn't want to worry anyone. By the time Jessica realized how sick he was, It had already ruptured. Mike was pulling on clothes, his hands shaking as he processed the information. His son, David's son, he corrected himself, was fighting for his life, and Mike hadn't even known he was sick. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was learning about this crisis from his mother, who had become more of a parent to these children than he'd ever been. "I'm coming," Mike said, then stopped. "Should I come? Do they want me there?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "They don't know I called you. Jessica and David are focused on Lucas right now. I just thought a father should know when his son is in surgery." The drive to St. Mary's Hospital took Mike through empty streets that blurred past his windows. He'd driven these same roads 8 years ago when Jessica was in labor, but he'd been in Europe then, building his business empire while she delivered their children alone. The hospital's emergency entrance was quiet at this hour, and Mike found the surgical waiting area easily. Through the observation windows, he could see David pacing with restless energy of a caged animal, still wearing pajama pants and a hastily thrown-on t-shirt. David's hair was disheveled, his face haggard with worry, and he moved with barely controlled panic that comes from watching your child disappear behind surgical doors. Emma and Sophie sat curled together on a waiting room couch, both girls in their nightgowns with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Sarah sat beside them, 13 years old, and trying to be strong for her younger sisters, while clearly struggling with her own fear. Catherine moved between the children and David, offering water and tissues, and the kind of quiet comfort that grandmothers specialize in providing during family crises. Jessica was nowhere to be seen. Mike positioned himself in an alcove where he could observe without intruding, feeling like a voyeur witnessing a family tragedy he had no right to share. This was their crisis, their family emergency, their child fighting for his life. Mike was a stranger observing from the outside, connected to the situation only by genetics he'd chosen to abandon. The waiting room held other families too. Parents holding vigil for children undergoing procedures, siblings trying to sleep in uncomfortable chairs, grandparents offering silent support through their presence. But the Brewer family stood out, not because of their circumstances, but because of how they handled them. Even in crisis, they functioned as a unit, each member knowing their role without being told, supporting each other with the practiced ease of people who'd weathered storms together before. "Daddy David," Sophie said quietly, "is Lucas going to be okay?" David stopped pacing immediately and knelt beside the couch, gathering both younger girls into his arms. "The doctors are taking very good care of him, Princess. They're fixing what's wrong so he can come home and teach you more magic tricks." "But what if—" Emma began, then stopped, unable to voice her fear. "Hey," David said gently, cupping Emma's face in his large hands. "Look at me. Lucas is strong, and he's stubborn, and he has the best doctors in the state taking care of him. Plus, he has all of us sending him love and prayers. That's pretty powerful medicine." Mike watched this exchange with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. David was handling the crisis with exactly the kind of steady reassurance children needed, providing comfort without false promises, acknowledging their fears while offering genuine hope. Catherine returned from the cafeteria with hot chocolate for the children and coffee for David, moving with efficiency of someone who'd appointed herself family coordinator during the crisis. "Dr. Martinez said the surgery is going well," Catherine reported. "They've removed the appendix and they're cleaning up the infection now. He said Lucas is strong and responding well to the antibiotics." David's shoulders sagged with relief, and Mike saw him close his eyes briefly in what was clearly a moment of grateful prayer. "Thank God," David whispered. An hour passed, then another. Mike watched David read stories to distract the girls, saw Catherine organize a quiet card game, observed Sarah take charge of distributing snacks with competence of someone who'd learned to help during family emergencies. This was a family that functioned well under pressure. Jessica finally appeared, emerging from the hospital chapel with red-rimmed eyes and the kind of pale exhaustion that comes from wrestling with fear and faith in equal measure. She moved directly to David, who wrapped her in his arms without words, holding her against his chest while she drew strength from his solid presence. "Any news?" Jessica asked quietly. "Surgery's going well," David reported, stroking her hair gently. "Dr. Martinez says Lucas is responding beautifully to treatment. Should be out of surgery within the hour." Jessica nodded against his chest, taking several deep breaths as she absorbed the good news. When she pulled back to look at David, her expression was one of absolute trust. This was a woman who'd learned she could depend on her partner completely, even in the worst moments. Dr. Martinez appeared an hour later, still in surgical scrubs but smiling. "The surgery went perfectly," he announced to the waiting family. "We removed the appendix and cleaned up all the infection. Lucas is going to be fine." The relief in the waiting room was palpable. David closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you," while Jessica covered her face with her hands and began crying with tears that wash away hours of accumulated fear. The girls woke up at the sound of good news, and soon the entire family was embracing in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. "Can we see him?" Emma asked. "He's in recovery now, Doctor," Martinez explained. "He'll be groggy for a while, but you can see him in about an hour." When they were finally allowed into recovery, Mike watched the family surround Lucas's hospital bed with gentle celebration that comes after fear has been replaced by gratitude. Lucas was pale and tired but alert, managing a weak smile when he saw his family. "Hey, buddy," David said softly, taking Lucas's hand. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone took my insides out and put them back wrong," Lucas replied with matter-of-fact honesty that made the adults laugh despite their lingering worry. "That's pretty much what happened," Jessica said, smoothing his hair back. "But now you're all fixed." "I was scared," Emma admitted quietly. "I didn't want anything bad to happen to you." "Me too," Lucas said honestly. "But I knew Dad and Mom would take care of everything, and they did." Mike felt those words like a physical blow. Lucas had never doubted that David and Jessica would handle the crisis, never questioned whether his parents would be there when he needed them most. As visiting hours ended and the family prepared to leave Lucas for the night, Mike watched David lean down to whisper something in the boy's ear that made Lucas nod seriously. Jessica kissed Lucas's forehead and promised to be back first thing in the morning. Mike remained hidden as the family walked past toward the parking garage, listening to their quiet conversation about schedules and logistics for the next few days. David would take time off work to manage Lucas's care. Jessica would coordinate with the school about homework. Catherine would handle meals and transportation for the girls. They had a plan, a support system, a network of people committed to ensuring Lucas's recovery was as smooth as possible. Mike realized he was witnessing the practical expression of the love this family had built together. Not just emotional support, but the tangible ways they showed up for each other when showing up mattered most. As their voices faded down the hospital corridor, Mike understood that he'd observed a family functioning exactly as families should during crisis, with unity, competence, and unwavering commitment to each other's well-being. Lucas would recover surrounded by people who'd chosen to love him completely, protected by the security David and Jessica had built through 8 years of consistent presence. Some children are blessed with parents who show up for every crisis, every celebration, every ordinary moment that becomes extraordinary through the alchemy of unconditional love. Lucas Brewer was one of those children, and Mike Purinen had made that possible by choosing to walk away. Chapter 10: The Phoenix's Flight. Some stories end with redemption, others with revenge, but the most powerful ones end with the simple, devastating beauty of someone learning to fly without the weight of your opinion holding them down. 6 months after Lucas's surgery, Mike found himself standing in the parking lot of Fort Braxton Elementary School on a crisp October morning, watching Jessica emerge from the parent-teacher conference building with the confident stride of a woman who'd learned to navigate the world on her own terms. She wore her dress uniform with casual authority, clearly having come directly from base, and moved with purposeful grace that drew admiring glances from other parents without her seeming to notice or care. Mike had come here with some vague notion of finally approaching her, of attempting a conversation that might lead to what? He'd spent the drive trying to formulate words that might bridge 8 years of silence, but watching her now, he realized the futility of his mission. Jessica didn't need his apologies or explanations. She'd grown beyond the need for his validation or even his acknowledgement. David appeared from a different building, clearly having attended Sarah's conference, while Jessica handled the Triplets meetings. When he spotted Jessica across the courtyard, his face lit up with automatic happiness of someone who never tired of seeing the person he loved most. They met in the middle of the walkway, and Mike watched David lean down to kiss Jessica's cheek while she showed him something on the papers she was carrying. "Emma's teacher says she's reading at a high school level," Jessica said, her voice carrying across the courtyard with unmistakable pride. "And Lucas wants to enter the state science fair with his earthquake prediction model." "Sophie?" David asked, wrapping his arm around Jessica's waist as they began walking toward the parking lot. "Still convinced she's going to be a professional dancer and a veterinarian, and the first person to live on Mars," Jessica laughed. "Her teacher says her confidence is inspiring, and her logic is creative." Mike watched them share the kind of parental moment that revealed the depth of their partnership. Two people equally invested in their children's development, equally proud of their individual achievements, equally committed to supporting whatever dreams those children chose to pursue. As they reached their cars, Mike watched Jessica check her phone and frown slightly. "What is it?" David asked immediately. "Colonel Morrison needs me back on base for an emergency briefing," Jessica said, her professional demeanor snapping into place. "Can you handle pickup today?" "Of course," David replied without hesitation. "I'll get all four, take them to Mom's for dinner, and we'll have homework finished before you get home." The casual efficiency of their coordination, the complete trust they had in each other's ability to manage family logistics, it all spoke of a partnership that had been tested by real life and proven resilient. Jessica stood on tiptoe to kiss David goodbye, and Mike heard her say quietly, "I love you too much sometimes. It scares me how much." "Good," David replied, cupping her face gently. "Love me like that for the next 60 years and see what happens." They separated toward their respective vehicles, but Jessica paused with her hand on her car door, her head tilted as if she'd sensed something. She turned slowly, scanning the parking lot with the alertness of someone whose military training had taught her to trust her instincts about being observed. Her eyes found Mike's across the distance, and for a moment they looked at each other across 8 years of silence and two completely different life trajectories. Mike expected anger or discomfort, perhaps even fear. Instead, Jessica's expression remained perfectly neutral, almost curious, as if she was looking at a stranger who happened to seem vaguely familiar. She walked toward him with measured steps, stopping about 10 feet away, close enough for conversation but far enough to maintain her space. Up close, Mike could see how 8 years had changed her. Small lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, confidence in her posture that came from learning to trust her own judgment, a kind of settled peace that suggested someone who'd found her place in the world and learned to defend it. "Mike," she said simply, her voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. Not anger, not warmth, not anything that suggested his presence affected her equilibrium. "Jessica," he replied, surprised by how strange her name felt in his mouth after so many years of avoiding it. You look well. Happy. I am, she said matter-of-factly. Very happy. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them while Mike tried to find words that might bridge the canyon his choices had created. Finally, he managed, I heard about Lucas's surgery. I'm glad he's okay. Jessica studied his face for a moment, perhaps wondering how he'd learned about a family crisis he had no right to know about. He's fine, she said quietly. Children are resilient when they have the right support system. The words weren't accusatory, but they carried the weight of truth that Mike couldn't argue with or dismiss. I've been thinking, Mike began, then stopped, realizing he had no idea how to continue that sentence. Mike, Jessica said gently, her voice carrying the patience of someone addressing a confused child. I need you to understand something. I'm not angry with you anymore. I haven't been for years. Anger requires energy I'd rather spend on my family. She glanced back toward David, who was loading something into his SUV, but keeping one eye on their conversation with protective attention. I've built a good life, Jessica continued, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every word she spoke. A complete life. My children are thriving, my marriage is strong, my career is meaningful, and I'm surrounded by people who've chosen to love me consistently. I don't need closure or explanations or apologies from you because I've learned to find peace without them. Mike felt those words like a diagnosis of his own irrelevance. Jessica had healed from wounds he'd inflicted, grown beyond damage he'd caused, and built something beautiful from the wreckage he'd left behind, all without requiring anything from him. The children, he said desperately. They're my children too, biologically. No, Jessica interrupted firmly but without hostility, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd had time to think through every possible version of this conversation. They're David's children. Legally, emotionally, practically. They call him Dad because he's earned that title through 8 years of showing up. You contributed DNA, Mike. David contributed everything else. The 2 AM fevers, the homework struggles, the broken hearts, the proud moments, the daily choice to love them even when they were difficult or demanding or testing boundaries. She wasn't being cruel, just honest in the way that cuts deeper than anger ever could. I know I made mistakes, Mike said weakly, hearing how pathetic the words sounded even as he spoke them. I was young. I was scared. You were scared, Jessica agreed, her tone neither condemning nor absolving. And you chose to let that fear make your decisions. I was scared too, but I chose to let love make mine. That's the difference between us. Mike looked at this woman he'd once been married to, seeing clearly how far she'd traveled from the uncertain 20-year-old who'd begged him not to leave. This Jessica knew her own worth, had built her own empire of love and respect, had learned to thrive in spite of rather than because of his choices. I hope someday you find what I found, Jessica said quietly. I hope you learn to love someone more than you fear losing them, and I hope they love you enough to help you become the man you're capable of being. But that's not my job anymore, Mike. It never really was. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back one final time. Take care of yourself, she said with the kind of general goodwill one might express to any acquaintance. And please, let us be happy. We've worked hard for this peace and we deserve to keep it. Jessica walked back to her car with the same confident stride she'd had when leaving the conference building. She didn't wave, didn't seem upset or disturbed by the encounter, didn't appear to give him another thought once their conversation ended. Standing in the parking lot, watching her taillights disappear, Mike finally understood that he'd just witnessed the completion of Jessica's transformation. She'd become someone who could encounter her past without being derailed by it, someone strong enough to be kind to people who'd hurt her while maintaining boundaries that protected her happiness. She'd chosen forgiveness not for his benefit, but for her own peace. She'd built a life so fulfilling that his absence was irrelevant rather than painful. She'd learned to fly without the weight of his opinion or presence or approval. Jessica Brewer had won, not by defeating him, but by transcending the need for victory altogether. She'd written a love story that began with his failure, but had been completed by two people who'd learned how to choose each other consistently, daily, forever. The most beautiful part was that she'd done it all without requiring his permission, his presence, or his applause. The phoenix had risen, spread her wings, and learned to soar in skies he'd never even imagined possible. In the end, the most profound revenge was no revenge at all, just the devastating grace of living beautifully without him,